The media under attack in Gaza. Israeli airstrikes flatten a tower containing the offices of Al Jazeera, the Associated Press, and homes for Palestinian families. But in the age of social media, can any side take control of the message? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. One of the main places for journalists to report on what's happening in Gaza is now just a pile of rubble. Israel is being condemned for carrying out airstrikes on a building that housed the offices of Al Jazeera, the Associated Press, and other international media. Staff were given just an hour to get out of Al Jalaa Tower. Families in 60 apartments inside also scrambled to collect what they could. Israel's military said Hamas operatives were using the 11-story building but hasn't provided proof.
That building is where Al Jazeera's offices are. There we are, another strike on that tower. And the tower has come down.
The destruction was broadcast live around the world. Al Jazeera called it a clear act to stop journalists conducting their sacred duty to inform. And the Associated Press said the world will know less about what is happening in Gaza because of what happened. On the ground, people recorded and shared their footage online. Social media has transformed the flow of information about the conflict, but activists have accused sites like Instagram of blocking their posts. Israel's defense minister urged Facebook and TikTok to remove content that he says incites violence and terrorism. A Palestinian activist told us recently why social media is so important to people like her.
Israeli media is really powerful. Israeli propaganda is really powerful. Our news, our stories couldn't reach anyone in the world. Today, our news, our sounds, our shouts are reaching many people around the world because we are the producers of our story. We produce the story. We take the photos. We take the footage. We take these stories and share them to the world. And this is why they started fighting against our stories and fighting against our posts.
Press freedom advocates have accused Israel of targeting the media. Since the start of its airstrikes on Gaza over a week ago, several journalists have been injured, arrested, or attacked, and dozens of media offices have been destroyed. Reporters Without Borders condemned what it called Israel's disproportionate use of force against journalists, saying they should under no circumstances be treated as parties to the armed conflict. In 2014, a Palestinian rights group said indiscriminate attacks on media buildings have been a significant feature of Israel's military offensive. 5 years later, Amnesty International accused Palestinian authorities in the occupied West Bank and Gaza of arresting, torturing, and violating people's rights to freedom of expression. A 2017 law in the occupied West Bank imposed tight controls on media freedom. Anyone who posted criticism online faced up to 15 years in jail. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Ramallah, Nour Odeh, a political analyst. In Tel Aviv, Arsen, Ostrovsky, CEO of the International Legal Forum. And also in Ramallah, Saleh, Hijazi, Deputy Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International. A warm welcome to you all. Nour, let me start with you today. Press freedom groups have condemned this attack on the Al Jalaa Tower. They accused Israel's military, which claims that the building housed Hamas military intelligence, of trying to censor coverage of what is happening in Gaza. What's your reaction?
I think what happened was a war crime, and there is really no room to kind of debate that. Al Jalaa building is a huge building. It doesn't just house media organizations, including Al Jazeera and AP. It also had many, many homes. It's a huge building in the center of Gaza, very prestigious building. And it's the third media building that Israel targeted this round of escalation. Of course, targeting and killing Palestinian journalists is not new to the way Israel operates during rounds of escalations. We've lost many friends and colleagues along the years while they were doing their jobs, because they were doing their jobs in different circumstances and in different years.
Arsen, from your perspective, when it comes to these rights groups and analysts who call this an attack on journalism, that this is an attack on freedom of information and the free flow of information, what do you say?
Look, I don't think this was an attack by any means on the media. This was an attack purely and squarely on Hamas. The question we have to be asking, though, is why were these media companies paying rent to an internationally recognized terrorist organization? We know for a fact now that Hamas had operations within that building. We know for a fact that Hamas had their research and development and their technical units there planning and carrying out terrorist attacks, and all the time under the noses of Al Jazeera, AP, and the other tenants, presumably, that were in that building. So the question is, why were they there, and did they, and how did they know that Hamas was not under their noses the entire time? At the end of the day, Israel is entitled to the right of self-defense. Israel is entitled to live in freedom. It is the Hamas that is responsible for placing their terrorist operations in the civilian building and infrastructure, and therefore making it a military target. Any country in the world would have done the same faced with this threat. Nonetheless, Israel did still give advanced notice and warning to all the tenants. But at the end of the day, the responsibility for this is solely with the Hamas for putting the media and jeopardizing the media in civilian areas, which is in itself an egregious violation of international law.
Arsen, let me just follow up with you very quickly about something you mentioned. Because, you know, the IDF, of course, we know, says that the building contained Hamas military intelligence assets. But, you know, AP CEO Gary Pruitt, he's called on the Israeli government to put forward the evidence that they have. He said that AP's bureau has been in this building for 15 years, that they've had no indication Hamas was in the building or active in the building. My colleague, Safwat al-Kahlout in Gaza, has said that there was no indication that Hamas was in the building. Is it not a reasonable thing to ask the Israeli government to produce the evidence that they have, that they say shows that Hamas was in that building?
Look, I mean, I find it very hard to believe that someone of the AP stature would not have known that they were operating right under or right by Hamas's noses. Hamas has been there for a number of years now. The questions we should be asking is why the questions that any decent professional journalist ought to have been asking is why Hamas was operating there, and why were they willing to acquiesce to their terms? I believe there is ample evidence that that Israel has certainly, I believe, shared with the United States administration. But it is known for a fact that this was a place in which Hamas had planned terrorist attacks, in which they had their technical unit, in which they carried out research and development. And again, all under the noses of both Al Jazeera and AP. And the questions really we need to be asking is why even an American company ought to be renting from a internationally designated and US designated terrorist organization, Hamas.
Arsen, I just want to add again that both Al Jazeera and the AP have denied those allegations that you were making against them. Nour, I see that you are reacting a lot to what Arsen is saying, so I'm going to give you a chance to respond.
I mean, it's just outrageous to find a way to continue just repeating a spin line to justify targeting not just media organizations. Again, I want to remind the audience, we're talking about scores of apartments, scores of families that were made homeless by this bombardment. There is such a thing that is, called proportionality in international law, even if we were to believe Israel's allegation, which I again say is false and as of yet unproven, and Israel never needed proof to attack journalists in the past. Fadl Shana'a, who was killed, a Reuters journalist, a Reuters cameraman who was killed a few years back, was killed while he was filming. He killed his own demise. He wasn't in a building controlled by Hamas or anybody else. He was doing his job. And Yasser Murtaja and so many others. So, to entertain this line is just really beyond bearable. There should be no circumstance when attacking journalists, when crippling the work of journalists who are there to do their job, to tell the story of a people under siege and under occupation. This is inexcusable, and any excuse to it is really just completely outrageous.
Saleh, let me turn to you now. Amnesty International has, over the years, documented what it calls a pattern of Israel restricting and attacking the rights of free expression. Do you consider what you saw yesterday, the attack on the Jalaa Tower in Gaza, to be in violation of international law?
Absolutely, and we think the ICC should look into it as a possible war crime. The attack on Jalaa Tower follows two patterns. The first is a pattern of collective punishment against the Palestinians in Gaza. According to Al-Mizan human rights organization working on the ground, there are at least 51 residential buildings and high-rise towers that have been destroyed in the recent military operation. The other pattern is silencing those who want to report and express what is happening in terms of the pattern of violations. Let me remind you and the viewers here that Amnesty International has been prevented by Israel from entering the occupied Gaza Strip since 2012. This also fits into that pattern, and indeed, what is happening currently in Gaza, we see has happened before in the 2014 military operation, and since then in the occupied West Bank, in East Jerusalem, with also attacking peaceful activists and attacking the press. So it definitely fits these two very, very worrying patterns.
Arsen, you heard Saleh there mention the International Criminal Court, and this gets to a point I wanted to ask you about, because the ICC opened an investigation into possible war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories. The top prosecutor for the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, said that the ICC is now monitoring current violence closely and that the evolution of these events could also be something that they look at. Is Israel not concerned about all this?
Look, Israel is very concerned about the situation at hand. It's concerned about the loss of life. It's concerned about the fact that we have had over 3,000 rockets rain down upon civilian areas in Israel by the Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. There have been at least 10 people that have died. There have been hundreds that have injured, and thousands upon thousands of families, including my very own, that have been forced to run to bomb shelter. Your previous guest spoke about proportionality. Let me ask her, what is a proportionate response here when over 3,000 rockets have been fired? Does she want more Israelis to have been killed? I'm sorry, but any time there are innocent civilians who die, that is a tragedy. But Israel will not and shall not defend or justify why we're defending our citizens from this exceptional, tremendous wave of terror from Gaza. At the end of the day, it is the Hamas that is committing a double war crime here. On the one hand, they are hiding behind Palestinian civilians, including civilian structures like the media building here, whilst they are targeting innocent civilians in Israel. No country in the world, not Israel, not any country in the world, ought to stand by that and will defend that. And the ICC, if it's going to be prosecuting, if it's going to be investigating anyone, it ought to be investigating both the Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as the sponsors, Iran, for initiating, inflaming, and carrying out this incredible wave of terror that we're experiencing right now.
Nour, Arsen, of course, just posed a question to you about those remarks you made regarding proportionality, so I'm going to give you a chance to respond if you'd like.
Well, I mean, you know, this is an old line that we've gotten all used to as Palestinians. But let me just remind the viewers, Palestinians have been under Israeli occupation for over half a century. Our daily reality under a foreign colonial military occupation is violent. Every detail of it is violent. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have lived under siege for 15 years, under an Israeli siege. Every detail of their life is controlled by Israel. Their basic rights are denied by Israel. So when we talk about violence, we need to put things in perspective. And when we talk about Israel defending itself, we need to also remember that Israel is the occupying power. It actually has obligations towards the safety and well-being of Palestinians, not just Israelis. It certainly has no right to traumatize, brutalize, dispossess, and kill Palestinians at will while claiming self-defense, much less maintain an illegal occupation for over half a century. That's the context of the story. The story didn't begin with Hamas firing rockets. It didn't even begin with Hamas creating rockets or manufacturing rockets or even importing rockets, if you will, if that was the case. It began with Israel's occupation. It persists because of Israel's occupation, because of Israel's impunity, because there are countries that are still willing to provide Israel with cover, to bankroll its violations, and to provide it with military assistance. That's why we're here. We're not here because there's an organization, a Palestinian organization that suddenly woke up and decided to rain terror on Israel as your guest would have it. We're here because an entire people is denied their basic right, crushed, brutalized, dispossessed, and then dehumanized by the kind of rhetoric we've heard by your guest. So it's, we keep going back at this, and we won't tire by reminding the world that we are, human beings entitled to the same rights as all others, and to have the colonizer claim the high moral ground is simply laughable.
Arsen, it looked like you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, look, perhaps some people think that Hamas is some kind of civil society organization that just operates a soup kitchen. Hamas is a violent terrorist jihadist organization whose primary mission and that is being sworn to Israel's very destruction. And I want to remind of a very, very simple fact. Israel left Gaza entirely in 2005. Every person, every settler, every soldier left Gaza completely. We had hoped that Gaza would become a beacon of peace, but instead Hamas took over, and it has now had a stranglehold over the people of Gaza as well as the people in the south of Israel. Right now, instead of stockpiling COVID vaccines, Hamas has been stockpiling rockets and rocks and tunnels to carry out terror attacks against Israeli civilians while holding the very people of Gaza hostage as well. So with all due respect, both people of Gaza and Israel deserve a better future, but it is the Hamas that is holding both people hostage, and that is a basic fact that we must recognize.
Saleh, you mentioned earlier that Amnesty International is not allowed to work on the ground in Gaza. Obviously, that is an impediment to your work at a time when it is so critical to get those stories out of Gaza, and at a time when Israel is being criticized for this attack on the Jalaa tower. I want to ask you how important it is for rights groups like Amnesty International and others to get those media reports out of Gaza, not just those traditional media reports that we've seen, TV outlets, but also now more and more the types of videos that are being shared on social media by far younger activists, stuff that's being shared widely, be they videos, be they infographics about what's going on. How much do groups like Amnesty International and others rely on that to do the kind of work that you're doing?
First of all, it is really crucial for us to be able to be on the ground and investigate allegations of crimes under international law and human rights violations by both sides. I mean, when Israel prevents us from entering Gaza, they're also preventing us from being able to investigate violations by the Palestinian armed groups. Then to your question about videos posted, there are, especially when we don't have access. And even when we do have access, they're very crucial at this time. We look at these videos, we verify the information, the geotag information behind them, and then we're able to cross-match them with testimony and pictures that we take from elsewhere. This is how we monitor the situation, and this is how we're able to document, especially when we are prevented access from Israel. But let me, if you allow me, Mohammed, just to go back to your, on some of the comments that your guest from Israel made. Three things. First, the ICC would be investigating Palestinian armed groups. Amnesty International and other rights groups have condemned the rockets. Indiscriminate rockets are a war crime, and the ICC would be looking into this. Second, the issue of proportionality. The test of proportionality is very specific to the incident itself. First, we need to be able to tell whether there was in Al-Jalaa building a legitimate military target. And second, the test of proportionality applies to that one incident, not to the totality of what's happening in the conflict. Third, the issue of Gaza and Israel pulling out. Let me remind everyone that Gaza has been under an illegal blockade since 15 years, since 2007, controlling every single bit that comes in and out of Gaza, limiting how much fishermen can go into the sea and farmers can farm along the Israel-Gaza border. This illegal blockade is collective punishment as well.
Saleh, let me just follow up with you very quickly about, we've been talking a lot about the ICC during this discussion, the specter of the ICC in all of this. And you had said that perhaps they will use, these videos that are emerging as part of their investigation. Do you think that the attack on the Jalaa Tower is actually going to factor into the investigation, in the long term?
Sorry, just to say, it factors into our investigations. Not to say it does into the ICC, though. They have their own professional ways of doing that. But
sure, but as a rights group, that's documenting this, and as a rights group that's alleging that war crimes were committed and saying that it's important that the ICC looks at this, do you think that it will factor in a major way into an investigation at some point?
Well, that's what we're calling for. We're calling for that to be factored in, and as well as the other 50 residential and high-rise towers that Israel has destroyed since this military operation, plus all the attacks that have caused civilians to lose their lives and that has targeted civilian infrastructures. Indeed, we call on the ICC to have a comprehensive investigation into everything that is happening at the moment, and going back since it started its jurisdiction into the OPT, which is June 2014. So we certainly hope that the investigation will be as comprehensive as possible.
Nour, there is, as we mentioned before in the program, sort of a new dimension to all of this in the fact that social media is playing such a large role in how information is being disseminated right now. And, we've spoken a lot in the past week to young Palestinian activists who are really frustrated with political leadership of the Palestinians and really feeling like it's ineffective and that they basically need to take ownership of their stories and get them out to the world in a way that makes the world understand their plight better. So let me ask you, do you feel that at the moment, these videos that are being shared widely, these infographics that are being created, that are being put on sites like Instagram and shared so widely, do you think that this is changing the perception around the world? Is it changing the narrative? Is it changing the coverage?
I think they're of paramount significance. What is happening on social media was a long time coming for Palestinians. It took them years, decades, to be able to crack open a small opening for their narrative and their voice to be heard by mainstream media. But when social media came, it was heaven sent. It was an opportunity for the voiceless to be heard, not just in Palestine, but in other places that do not usually invite media attention and focus. And quite frankly, these platforms provided young Palestinians with a chance to connect with the outside world, to tell their story, their personal story, not just their, the story of what was happening, of the politics of it, of the gruesome details of it, but just on a human level. And to see that being censored and curtailed, and to see Palestinian voices being muted is really worrying, because at the end of the day, that free space that we thought we were finally able to reach out to the world through and receive solidarity through and offer solidarity to others through is now that space is shrinking. Of course, before that, we've seen Palestinian journalists also detained or harassed by Israeli intelligence because of their posts on Facebook. A colleague of ours, Jalaa, was recently detained and sentenced to more than 3 months in prison, administrative detention, that is, no charge, no trial, and he was specifically told this was because of his journalistic activities on social media. At the time, it was related to elections. So that space is very important, and it has been on the, under assault, if you will, but now that assault is far more comprehensive and systematic, and I think, these platforms should be ashamed of themselves for doing what they are, although the hirings that they've done kind of told the story before it began.
All right, we have run out of time, so we are going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Nour Odeh, Arsen, Ostrovsky, and Saleh, Hijazi. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.